I mentioned earlier that if you're going to be working with a traverse or a boundary and you want to enter that, that the best way to do that, or I think the best way to do that, is by utilizing a enter deed description command rather than the commands I was just showing you. So I have a short legal description here. I'll go ahead and enter. I actually use this in training with people. It doesn't have a whole lot of legs to it, but it does include both lines and arcs, and it has a closure that is really, really bad. So that makes it more fun that way. So all I have in here right now is a point to start at. So I'm in a different drawing than I was using before, just jumped over up here. And we'll go to the survey menu and go down to enter deed description. Lots of options here. We can define the layer that we want to work on. Before I do that, you know what I'm going to do, guys? I'm going to go double check my point defaults here. Yeah, because I was playing with this earlier too. Reset that starting point number. All right, we'll get back into legal description writer. All right, so what layer are we going to put the line work on? By default, it goes to deed, but you can change this to boundary or whatever you need it to be. PNTS is Carlson's default layer for points to go to. We've got our symbol and our text scalar sizes. So 1/10 of whatever the drawing scale is. We're going to do this traverse by bearing. So again, look at the description that you have, the information you have, and you can adjust that. I'll have it put in complete points. So I'll have the symbol, the point number, the elevation, and the description for it. You have a couple of options there. We can have it apply a rotation to those things. I'm going to have it label the lines and arcs, so that's done. We have the ability to go in and edit those settings and make changes to them. So if we need to make an adjustment or load a different group of settings, we can do that. Those are the specific auto annotate, and the general settings are here. If you have a particular annotation style you need, you can actually load it right from this point by selecting it. Our first deed will be called Lot 1. We will go ahead and draw the line work for that. We'll prompt for the descriptions. And at the end, we'll create a polyline. And then we come to one of my personal preferences. I'd like to turn on store raw data file and store deed file. The reason being, if there's an error that's made along the way, rather than trying to back up and correct the error, I can actually just keep going and then correct the error in these two files and redraw the lines and the points. The raw file redraws the points, the deed file redraws the line work. But that way, if I discover the error was several entries back, I don't have to try and back up to there and redo it. That can be problematic at times. And we'll see how all this works out here when we hit OK, because I think those files already exist. So we'll just tell it to overwrite them. Command line, it wants us to pick a point or a point number to start at, which is why I made sure there was a point in here. So we're starting at point 1, and then it wants us to start entering information, and it's using the familiar quadrant format. So without giving you too much in excess of information, I'll just start entering this. Start in quadrant 3 at 90 degrees. I'll put in the zeros this time just to show that it doesn't matter whether you put them in or leave them out. Either one will work. And we get our distance put in feet. Notice we also support chains, rods, meters, and other rare and eclectic formats there. rather than using the full description of corner, I'm just going to shorten that up to COR. And now it's ready for the next angle. So I've got a couple of extra options here. There is an undo option. We'll talk about that. And here's the exit. And we'll be using the curve a little bit later. So moving on to the next entry, quadrant 1, 17 degrees, 13 seconds. A couple 100 feet there. And I can zoom out and pan as I'm doing this. And then accept my corner. So you can see it's drawing the points for me as we go. We'll do quadrant 1 again. And then eventually we get to a point where we can change quadrants and go to quadrant 2. And like I was mentioning earlier, it is important to keep an eye on that command line. It's easy to get out of sequence. If you forget to acknowledge the corner here and you type in your bearing and hit enter, it's going to put the bearing in as your description. And then all of a sudden your distance becomes your bearing and you have what we would call a mistake. The other thing I'll point out with this undo function is if you discover you did something like I just described, make sure you get to the end of the entry. Make sure you get back to this point where it's ready to start a new leg and undo, because then it will undo the entire leg and take you back to the previous point. Doing undo in the middle can be a little tricky. All right, this next leg is a curve, so we'll hit C for curve, just using the capital letter from there. It wants the radius, which is 75 feet. It is going to the left, so we'll use a minus sign there. And we have an arc length of 46.5 feet. And I know it's on an arc, but we'll go ahead and just do that. You'll notice it did not set a radius point for me. That's something you could come back at a later time and add if you need to. At the command line, what's in the bracket is the default answer. So if I just hit enter, I'm going to be doing a curve, which we have a second curve here. It has a radius of 25 feet and is going to the right, so we'll use a plus sign. And it has a length of 39.27 feet. All right, we're almost done here, guys. We're going to go back to a line, except my corner there. So we'll type B for bearing. And this is going to quadrant 3, 0 degrees, 3 seconds, 3 minutes, 41 seconds. For a distance of 177.39. And we put in our corner. So now we've finished entering all the legs here. It's important to use the exit command to close this out. The reason being, when you exit is when it writes the deed and the raw file. Now they're written out. If I just escaped out of the command at that point, it wouldn't actually write those files and I wouldn't have them available. So I do need to make sure I use the exit there. And finally, it's prompting to select the entity for area calculation. We'll slide this up a little bit. So it's got my area here, my perimeter, square feet, acres. So I've got 0.85 acres. It's got my error of closure, my bearing for the error. So there's my distance, and there's my precision, which I think anyone who does these knows that's not the number you're looking for. But again, my point is, let's learn how to use enter deed description and get things labeled. So we can zoom in and look, and there's our labels. Here are the curve labels using the delta symbol for the delta angle, our points, and we're all set up. So I've made an issue or brought up why that I think it's valuable to have these other files. So let's take a quick look at those files. If we go into process deed file, there's the main file, open. You can have multiple lots in here. I just have lot 1. If I go into edit, I can see the line work. And if I click on a particular line, it shows me, highlights it for me, so I know where I'm at. Same with the curves. And I can edit any of this information and it will update here so I see the effect of that edit. But then I can save that edit and redraw it. And it will erase the existing line work and redraw the new line work. I can also generate a report from here, just using our standard report viewer. Get the angle and distance precision. And so here's my deed report, which again gives me my closure information. So I've got my total area and my closure information. From here, I can save this file out. I can print it. I can place it in the drawing as mtext. So a lot of flexibility on how I can deal with this from here. All right. I can also export this information to the RW5 file, or I can use the report formatter, which allows me to pick and choose how it gets exported. So I'll just go ahead and exit out of that. And then go look at the raw file. We do that under Edit Process Raw Data. File, open, get our raw file. Now, I will point out here, again, I've got my boundary drawn, I've got my points labeled. Do be aware that that happens because under Display, Graphics, I have it turned on. By default, that's turned off, and so you wouldn't have this display down here. So if you don't have that, go ahead and turn this on, then you'll see your line work. And again, I can edit any of the information in here, save it out, and then have it redraw the points, update the coordinate file and redraw the points. So I get those locations corrected as well. That's why we store the files. All right, so that kind of walks us through the initial enter deed description. With this, I can go ahead and annotate the area on screen if I want to. By picking an interior point, I'm not going to get a terribly accurate area because we've got this roughly 5-foot bust over here. So ultimately, that would be the first thing that should probably be addressed. So let's talk about legal descriptions. Kind of going full circle here. We started with a legal description, entered the deed, and now we're going to create a new legal description from that. We go to survey and our legal description writer. Lots of great tools in here. Simple stuff to do. You pick the boundary polyline. We're done. You can pick point groups. Be a little careful about the arcs because the point group is going to give you the chord information. You can pick inside the boundary, and again, that would be problematic here because the first and last lines aren't going to give you all the information because it's going to stop where they intersect. I could use the deed file that I created earlier. So that's another option, all right? The additional inputs, header and footer files, if you're doing, for instance, a subdivision, and you need to have the same information at the start of every single legal description for every lot, you can type that up in a text file, just using Notepad or another text editor, and then save that file. And in here, you simply go in and you would select that file and tell it, I want to use this text file as my header. My recommendation is, if you want the most flexibility when you put the legal description in your drawing, put that text on a single line. I realize it could get kind of long, but the advantage is if we place this as M-text, I can adjust the size of the M-text box, and that text will automatically realign its paragraph to fit. Whereas if I put carriage returns in it, then I'm kind of stuck with where those are. All right. So both of these, information you start with, information you end with, as long as it's consistent, you can do that. The reference polyline is referring to tying my point of beginning here, point 1, back to some section corner far away from where we are. It can be a single line, so if they're using GPS and they shot the section corner and shot here, connect it with a polyline and you can pick that. If they used a total station and traversed in, just do a continuous polyline. Make sure the direction is going the right way of the polyline. So you'd want that polyline to start at the section corner and go to your point of beginning, so it gets read in that way. But this would allow you to add that to the legal description as well. Your output options. You can use the report viewer that we saw already. You can write out a text file. You give the file a name with a TXT extension. That's handy if you're going to take it into Microsoft Word and do editing there and print it up on letterhead to send in as a submittal. Or you can create M-text in the drawing. The reason I leave it on the report viewer is once I am looking at it in the viewer, I can do this. I can save it to a text file from there. I can also do this, write it out as M-text into my drawing. So this one gives me the most flexibility on what to do with it. So I tend to leave it there. So there are a lot of different settings down here. Some are more interesting than others. The best part is if you're working with multiple jurisdictions, different cities, counties, and they have little nuances in their legal descriptions that they want, even if it's header and footer files, you can save those out with that particular jurisdiction's name and then reload them as you need them for new work. So you don't have to do this every time, but you've got information on how to set up your angles for north and east and how you want that displayed, the symbols that you want for degrees, minutes, and seconds. Distance has the fewest settings in it, but again, it's a distance of is what's going to be put in the legal description. If they need a little bit different verbiage there, that's fine. Curves have a lot more data involved. Things that make this useful are you get all the different types of text that you need to add, but you also get to control what's labeled and the order that it's labeled in the legal description. So you have quite a bit of control over all that curve data. Other general information, this goes back to the reference line settings and how that's set up. Layer the M-text goes to when we place it. All right. So once you've picked your boundary polyline, and if you have a reference polyline, you've picked that, your settings are ready to go, we click OK, and there we are. And as I mentioned before, I can write this out as a text file, save it as a TXT. I can also print it, or I can put it in the drawing as M-text. And we'll just set it right there. Here's my angle. And when I exit, here it is in my drawing. And much like the header file that I talked about where you put it all on one line, yes, this is longer than I would want, but the idea is I can just grab it by the corner and resize this box so it looks a little more uniform. And I don't have to worry about where it's breaking for paragraphs, and I can adjust it at will. The one Really nice thing about these legal descriptions. We're not intending to take you 100% of the way. We're really looking at getting you 80, 85% of the way to your final legal. There'll be some cleanup you'll want to do. But what we do know is all of the bearings, all of the distances, all of the numbers are completely accurate. Nobody inadvertently transposed a number or added an extra zero to something. So the numbers are all accurate, and that's nice when you start thinking about errors and omissions and doing plan checks. At least that information is solid. Okay. So there's the legal description writer. May take a few minutes to set up initially, but should probably be worth the time. And the last thing I want to chat about here briefly is the map check routine. We saw an example of where we can get the error of closure information, map check type information from the deed description, but sometimes you want to run it separately. You can do it by points, but again, I'll caution you about how that's going to work with ARCs if you're using just the points. So I tend to do it by screen entities. I don't use the auto select. I'm working in feet. We'll use 2 decimals for distance. And then we go back to watch your command line. It says select line work to process. So I'm going to pick my boundary line, and I can pick it anywhere. Watch your command line. Select sample text. Okay, so I'll zoom in and pick that text. Watching the command line, it says select second sample text. Well, I'm going to deliberately select the curve text. What the routine is doing here is looking for the layers that things are on. Now, I know all of the bearings and distances are on the same layer, so that's fine. I think the curve data is on the same layer as well. But just in case, give it a couple selections. And then finally, watching the command line, it says select entities. So you select all the entities you want it to process. And now we hit enter. Then you have some options here. How does it identify a distance? Well, distances will have a tick mark for feet, double ticks for inches, CH for chains. Degrees, minutes, and seconds. You're telling it what symbols it's looking for there. Bearings. Basically, as it looks at the labels, what identifies a particular label as being a bearing, and how do we know when we have degrees, minutes, and seconds on things? And again, you can save out different formats, reload them, but we'll just go ahead and hit OK here. And we get our report. Surprisingly, we still have the same closure error distance. We still have the same bearing, and we still have this horrible closure precision. But again, as we saw before, by bringing it here, I can save it, print it, or put it in my drawing as mtext. The other nice thing I can do by coming through here is I can look at it and say, I like having the date in here, but for heaven's sake, I really don't need a timestamp on this. It'd be nice to know what day the report was done. So I can take that part out and then go ahead and put it in my drawing as mtext. Now, since I edited it, it would like to save that. It also wants to save a deed file at this point. So that's another little feature of the map check, is it'll save a deed file out. And then you have that to reference. But we created the deed file for this when we entered it, so I really don't need to. So I'll just exit without creating that. All right. So there is my error of closure map check report.